A millionaire CEO met a homeless girl who made toys from trash. What she showed him changed his life forever. Alexander Blake wasn't used to wearing a worker's jumpsuit. His wardrobe consisted almost exclusively of custom-tailored suits, polished shoes, and silk ties. Yet on this particular morning, he found himself dressed in a plain blue overall, the kind his warehouse employees wore, as he walked through the narrow aisles of his oldest factory storage facility. His presence there wasn't ceremonial, there was a supply chain issue that needed direct oversight, or so his operations manager had insisted. Alexander believed in efficiency and control, which meant that if something wasn't working, he had to see it with his own eyes. The visit was meant to be quick: inspect the inventory, ask a few sharp questions, get back to the high-rise office where decisions were made. After an hour of walking the facility, checking off lists and ensuring his directives had been followed, Alexander felt the walls close in. The factory air was dense, heavy with dust and the lingering smell of cardboard. He excused himself and stepped outside, craving fresh air and a moment of quiet before diving back into his day. He had barely taken 2 steps past the industrial loading dock when a flash of red caught his attention. A small figure approached him at an unexpected speed. A girl, no older than 6, with messy blonde hair that caught the sunlight like a halo and striking blue eyes that seemed far too clear to belong in such a grimy environment. She wore a red dress, faded and frayed at the edges, as though it had lived through too many days without proper care. She stopped right in front of him, her gaze direct and unafraid, and asked, "Do you have super glue?" Alexander was momentarily taken aback. He was a man used to people addressing him with hesitation, often cloaked in layers of politeness or fear. Yet here was this small child, standing before him in a factory yard, asking for glue as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Curiosity piqued, he patted the pockets of his jumpsuit and, to his own surprise, found a small tube of industrial-grade super glue. Without a word, he handed it to her. The girl accepted the glue with a small nod of gratitude, then tilted her head and said, "Do you want to see my toys?" Alexander blinked. Meetings waited for him, reports piled up on his desk, and the city's demands didn't pause. Still, something about her made him stop. She didn't ask him for money, or food, or help. She offered to show him her toys. Out of sheer instinct and perhaps an unfamiliar tug at his chest, he said, "Lead the way." He followed her as she skipped ahead, weaving through the back alleyways of the industrial block, moving with a confidence that told him she knew these paths too well. They turned a corner, and suddenly, the manicured streets and clean glass windows of his corporate world felt like a different universe. They reached a cluttered space behind the factory, where overflowing trash bins lined the cracked concrete walls. This was no playground. It was a forgotten space, reeking of discarded packaging, broken pallets, and leftover debris from shipments long gone. But to the little girl, this was her workshop. With a proud smile, she knelt beside a flattened cardboard box and began displaying her creations. She showed him a disposable fork with 2 googly eyes glued on, its arms crafted from strips of torn cardboard. Another toy was a plastic bottle cap turned into a tiny car wheel, tied to a matchstick axle. There was a robot-like figure, made entirely of bent straws and bottle wrappers, its body fragile but full of character. "I make my own toys because I don't have money," she said, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. "But I have a lot of ideas." Alexander found himself crouching down to her level, mesmerized not by the toys themselves, but by the resourcefulness they embodied. In his world, creativity was a department with a budget and deadlines. But here, it was raw, pure survival, an act of reclaiming joy from whatever the world had discarded. For the first time in a long while, Alexander Blake was speechless. This child had managed to create something far more genuine than any focus group or designer pitch he had sat through in the last decade. "What's your name?" he asked, though he already knew this wasn't a conversation that would end with introductions and polite farewells. "Emmy," she replied simply. He was struck by the weight of this moment. Emmy wasn't here to be pitied. She was here to show him her world, a world built from scraps, but held together with imagination. And suddenly, his empire of glossy products and strategic marketing felt fragile, hollow in comparison. Kneeling beside a little girl in a red dress, surrounded by what others would call garbage, Alexander Blake felt something shift deep within him. He had come to this warehouse to fix a supply problem. But now, he realized, he had stumbled upon a far bigger problem, one that couldn't be solved with spreadsheets or board meetings. He looked at Emmy, holding up her fork figurine with pride, and knew instinctively that this was not the end of an unexpected encounter. It was the beginning of something that would change everything. Alexander Blake stood in that forgotten alley, surrounded by the sharp scent of damp cardboard and industrial waste, yet his attention was entirely consumed by Emmy and her creations. It was as though the entire world had narrowed to this small clearing behind the factory, where a 6-year-old girl had, with nothing but scraps and imagination, built her own universe. Emmy continued to pick up her toys, explaining their stories with a seriousness that both amused and humbled him. Each fork became a character with a name, each bottle cap had a purpose. In her eyes, nothing was trash, it was all raw material for play. Alexander, a man who had built a toy empire based on precision-engineered products and pristine packaging, found himself both fascinated and uncomfortable. He had always believed in innovation, but seeing Emmy's hands bring life to discarded plastic and cardboard revealed a truth he had conveniently ignored. Sometimes, the greatest creativity flourishes where resources are scarce. As Emmy knelt to adjust a piece of string holding together a makeshift puppet, Alexander's gaze wandered to their surroundings. The factory loomed behind them, its clean, corporate facade a stark contrast to this messy, chaotic space. His mind, trained to evaluate processes and streamline operations, began to churn. How was it possible that in a company that prided itself on leading the toy industry, a child found more joy and creativity among trash bins than in any product his designers had developed in years? The question gnawed at him. Emmy didn't know he was the CEO of the very corporation that mass-produced toys she would never afford. To her, he was just a man in a blue jumpsuit who happened to have super glue in his pocket. The simplicity of that made Alexander realize how detached he had become from the core purpose of his business. He watched Emmy's fingers, dirt-streaked but nimble, as she attached cardboard wings to a tiny figure made from a popsicle stick. She looked up at him suddenly, her expression shifting from playful to curious. "Do you work here?" she asked, tilting her head. Alexander was about to answer instinctively, ready to recite his usual title, but something stopped him. For once, he didn't want to be the CEO in this conversation. "I help fix things here," he replied simply. Emmy smiled, satisfied with that answer, and went back to her work. The sun began to lower, casting a soft golden hue over the alley. Emmy, unfazed by the time, continued crafting, humming a tune to herself. Alexander remained crouched beside her, his knees protesting against the cold concrete, but his mind more active than it had been in years. He thought about his board meetings, the endless presentations filled with market trends and consumer analytics. None of those numbers had prepared him for this small, defiant act of creativity in the shadow of a factory that had forgotten what toys were supposed to mean. Emmy paused and offered him a piece of cardboard and a marker. "You can make one too, if you want." The invitation was innocent, but to Alexander, it felt like a challenge. His hands, more accustomed to signing contracts than cutting cardboard, fumbled with the materials. Emmy watched him patiently, guiding him as he awkwardly tried to assemble a small figure. For the first time in his life, he found himself experiencing toys not as products, but as creations, personal, imperfect, alive. As they worked, Alexander asked softly, "Where do you go at night, Emmy?" She shrugged, not looking up. "I stay here. Sometimes I find a dry spot. It's okay. I'm used to it." Her answer, so casual, struck him harder than any boardroom accusation ever had. He had spent years navigating corporate crises, but never had a problem felt so human, so immediate. This wasn't a matter of donations or charity events. Emmy didn't need pity or a temporary fix. She needed a space where her imagination could thrive safely, without having to scavenge for materials or shelter. Alexander stood up slowly, dusting off his hands. The sun had dipped lower, and the city's distant hum began to rise as people finished their workdays. Emmy packed her creations into a small, tattered backpack, her movements efficient and practiced. Watching her, Alexander felt a surge of responsibility he couldn't shake. He realized that the solution wasn't to offer her a few dollars or donate a toy. It had to be bigger. It had to be real. He crouched back down to her level, meeting her eyes. "Emmy, would you like to come with me? I think I have a place where you can make all the toys you want, and you won't have to worry about running out of glue." She froze, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to detect any hidden motive. "Not to a place with lots of rules," she asked cautiously. "No," Alexander said, his voice steady. "To a place where people listen." For a few moments, she said nothing. Then she nodded, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. There was no drama, no tears, just a quiet agreement between two people who, in their own ways, had been navigating worlds that didn't understand them. Alexander extended his hand. Emmy took it. As they walked back towards the factory, Alexander knew that this small girl had already shifted something fundamental inside him. What began as a chance encounter by a loading dock was evolving into a mission he hadn't anticipated but now couldn't ignore. He wasn't entirely sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: Emmy was coming with him, not as a charity case, but as a creator, a collaborator, and perhaps, the truest toy designer he had ever met. Alexander Blake had never brought anyone like Emmy into the towering glass headquarters of Blake Toys before. The company's main office was a monument to corporate perfection: marble floors, sleek modern furniture, and walls lined with awards that gleamed under carefully positioned lighting. The moment they stepped through the entrance, Emmy's small hand still tucked firmly into his, the air seemed to shift. Employees, accustomed to greeting their CEO with formal nods and controlled smiles, paused mid-step as their eyes landed on the little girl in the faded red dress and scuffed sneakers. Her backpack, stuffed with cardboard and plastic scraps, stood in stark contrast to the polished leather briefcases and designer handbags that usually passed through the lobby. Alexander ignored the stares. For the first time, he wasn't concerned about the optics. He wasn't thinking about investor perception or media narratives. His focus was solely on Emmy, who walked beside him with a mixture of curiosity and calm, her gaze moving across the space, unimpressed by its pristine surfaces. She had just come from a world where play wasn't dictated by price tags or packaging, and Alexander was beginning to realize how hollow this building looked through her eyes. When they reached the executive floor, Claire, his longtime assistant, approached with a puzzled expression. She was used to managing crises and schedules down to the second, but this was new. "Mr. Blake, who is," she began, but Alexander raised his hand gently, cutting her off without malice. "Claire, this is Emmy. She'll be working with me today." Claire's professional instincts kicked in, and though her eyebrows lifted for a brief moment, she nodded and pivoted into action. "Of course. Should I prepare the design room?" Alexander smiled faintly. "No. We'll be working here." The design team was summoned to the main conference room, a space typically reserved for high-stakes product pitches and strategic planning. The designers entered, expecting a formal session, perhaps an emergency review of sales strategies. What they found instead was their CEO standing at the head of the table, next to a small girl who was carefully unpacking makeshift toys onto the gleaming glass surface. Emmy laid out her creations with care: a fork with paper wings, a bottle-cap creature, a puppet made of string and scrap cloth. The designers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what they were witnessing. Alexander addressed them without his usual corporate tone. There was no performance, no layered strategy in his words. "Today, we're going to listen. Emmy has something to teach us about toys, something we've forgotten." The team, though skeptical, sat down. They had seen their fair share of consultants, analysts, and marketing experts over the years, but none of them had ever arrived with a backpack full of trash. Emmy began speaking, not with rehearsed pitches or carefully curated slides, but with the unfiltered honesty of a child who had never been taught to dilute her thoughts. She explained how each toy had a story, how she didn't need them to light up or make sounds, because she could imagine those parts. She described how the act of making the toy was just as important as playing with it, and how every crack and imperfection gave the toy character, gave it life. The room, initially filled with polite patience, grew increasingly attentive. The designers, trained to chase after trends and sleek aesthetics, were being confronted with a perspective they hadn't considered in years. One of the senior designers, an older man named Douglas who had been with the company since its early days, leaned forward, fascinated. "You're saying kids don't need perfect toys?" Emmy nodded. "They need toys that feel like they're part of their story, not just from a box." The simplicity of her words struck the room silent. It was a concept that had been buried beneath years of focus group reports and glossy ad campaigns. They had been designing for retail shelves, not for children's hands and imaginations. Alexander watched the interaction unfold with a growing sense of pride. Emmy was not intimidated by the suits, the titles, or the polished boardroom. She spoke with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. And the team, to their credit, began to listen not as experts dissecting a new angle but as people reconnecting with the reason they had chosen to design toys in the first place. By the end of the meeting, the table was littered with sketchpads and brainstorming notes. Emmy had inspired a shift, not by dictating ideas, but by opening a door to a perspective that had long been closed off in the rush for marketable perfection. Douglas, with a thoughtful smile, looked at Alexander and said, "We've been overthinking everything." As the team dispersed, energized and slightly humbled, Alexander turned to Emmy, who was busy tucking her toys back into her backpack. "You did well," he said softly. Emmy shrugged, as though it had been the most natural thing in the world. "I just told them what I do every day." The rest of the office day was unrecognizable from the norm. Word of Emmy's presentation spread quickly, and employees who had spent years buried under spreadsheets found themselves reflecting on how disconnected they had become from the simple joy of play. Claire later confided in Alexander that she had overheard junior staff members talking about wanting to build their own trash toys at home. That evening, Alexander took Emmy to his personal office, a large space with panoramic city views and a desk that felt suddenly too big and too empty. Emmy, unaffected by the room's grandeur, dumped her backpack on the plush leather sofa and began building a new toy from the spare office supplies she found: paper clips, sticky notes, even a discarded coffee stirrer. Alexander watched her work, realizing that the millions of dollars spent on design labs had never produced a prototype as genuine as the one Emmy crafted with her tiny, dirt-smeared hands. For the first time in his career, Alexander Blake wasn't concerned with the next product launch or the upcoming investor briefing. He was thinking about how many Emmys were out there, kids with ideas, with stories, who had never been given a seat at the table. And he knew, without a doubt, that his company's future didn't lie in more polished designs, but in rediscovering the messy, beautiful heart of creativity. As the city lights flickered to life outside, Alexander made a quiet promise to himself and to Emmy. This wasn't going to be a one-time gesture. This was the start of a new chapter, for both of them. And as Emmy handed him a makeshift paperclip figure, giggling at its wobbly legs, Alexander understood, she wasn't just changing his company. She was changing him. The next few days at Blake Toys were unlike anything the company had ever experienced. Emmy, now a familiar presence within the glass walls of the towering headquarters, had unknowingly ignited a quiet revolution. What had started as a spontaneous moment in a conference room had rippled through every department. Alexander watched in awe as his carefully structured corporate environment began to unravel, not into chaos, but into something far more alive. Teams that once operated in isolated silos found themselves gathering in common spaces, sketching ideas on whiteboards with a raw enthusiasm that had been absent for years. The hierarchy, so rigid and predictable, started to blur. Senior designers sat cross-legged on the floor beside interns, debating the best way to create toys that children could finish building themselves. Emmy, unaware of the stir she had caused, continued to wander through the offices as if they were an extension of her playground. She would stop at desks, peek into open meeting rooms, always carrying her small backpack filled with makeshift toys and scraps of new materials she had scavenged from around the building. To her, these suits and polished floors were just a bigger canvas. One afternoon, she found herself in the company's packaging department, a place known for its sterile efficiency. She climbed onto a workstation table and asked why the boxes had so much plastic if children only cared about what was inside. The room, used to operating by template designs, went silent. Her question was so simple, yet no one had ever thought to ask it. That moment sparked a redesign initiative that would eventually save the company millions in packaging costs while introducing eco-friendly alternatives that would later become a marketing triumph. Meanwhile, Alexander found himself caught between two worlds. On one hand, he had to face the escalating concerns of his board of directors and shareholders. Their emails grew more aggressive, their meeting requests more insistent. They wanted reassurances, spreadsheets that proved this child-led creativity experiment wouldn't derail profits. But Alexander had stopped caring about appeasing numbers. The truth was evident in the halls of his own building, where energy and collaboration had returned in a way no quarterly review could measure. On the other hand, there was Emmy. She had become more than an accidental advisor, she was now the pulse of a movement that Alexander himself was still trying to understand. Each evening, as the corporate day slowed, Alexander and Emmy would retreat to his office, where Emmy would spread out her scraps and begin constructing new characters. She would narrate their backstories, explaining why a bent paper straw was a wizard's staff or how a bottle cap was actually a hero's shield. Alexander, who had spent his career analyzing demographics and market shares, found himself captivated by these stories. It wasn't the product she was creating that mattered, it was the act of creation itself. One evening, as the city skyline turned a soft amber, Claire entered Alexander's office carrying a thick folder filled with financial forecasts. "You need to look at these before the investor call tomorrow," she said, but her voice lacked its usual urgency. She glanced at Emmy, who was busy constructing a house from paper clips, and for a moment, the hardened efficiency in her demeanor softened. "She's changing this place," Claire said, more to herself than to Alexander. Alexander took the folder but placed it unopened on his desk. "Claire, when was the last time you saw this company so alive?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched Emmy, who was now singing quietly to herself, completely absorbed in her creation. "I think this is the first time," Claire admitted. The upcoming investor call loomed over Alexander like a storm. He knew the questions they would ask, the numbers they would demand, the skepticism they would hurl. But for once, he wasn't preparing defensive talking points. He was preparing to tell them a story, not of profits or projections, but of a small girl who had taught an entire corporation to remember why they existed in the first place. The morning of the call, Alexander made an unorthodox decision. Instead of presenting alone from his office, he set up the call in the company's main design room. Emmy sat beside him at the table, her backpack spilling over with her familiar collection of trash toys. As the video screens flickered to life, rows of suited investors appeared, their expressions a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled irritation. They were expecting charts, bar graphs, and bulletproof strategies. What they got was Emmy holding up a toy made from a bottle cap and a shoelace, explaining how it was more fun to build than to buy. Alexander didn't interrupt her. He let the silence settle after she finished. Then, he spoke, not with corporate bravado, but with genuine conviction. He explained how the company had spent years manufacturing toys designed by adults, for the approval of other adults, while forgetting the simplest truth: toys belong to children. He described how Emmy had reawakened a culture of listening within the company, how her ideas had already led to tangible product innovations and operational improvements. He presented not spreadsheets, but testimonials from his own employees, who had found new purpose in their work. The investors, blindsided by the unexpected presentation, had little to say at first. But slowly, questions shifted from concerns about immediate profits to curiosity about long-term vision. They wanted to know how this could scale, how the authenticity they had just witnessed could translate into a market advantage. Alexander answered them with a calm assurance that came not from strategy, but from belief. He knew this path wasn't conventional, nor was it risk-free. But it was real. And in a market drowning in manufactured trends and artificial engagement, reality was the most valuable asset they could offer. After the call ended, Alexander sat back in his chair, feeling a calm he hadn't felt in years. Emmy looked up at him and asked, "Did we win?" Alexander smiled, leaning down to her level. "We're just getting started." As the day progressed, the atmosphere within Blake Toys transformed. Departments that had once operated in routine now buzzed with renewed purpose. Emmy continued to move through the building, her presence no longer a novelty but a welcomed reminder of why they were there. Alexander, walking through his company's hallways, realized that for the first time, they weren't chasing trends or fighting for market share. They were building something far more resilient, a company culture rooted in creativity, humility, and the willingness to listen. The challenges ahead were undeniable. Not every investor would understand. Not every product would be an immediate success. But Alexander had learned a truth more powerful than any quarterly report. When you build from the heart, people notice. And in Emmy, he had found the heart his company had been missing all along. In the weeks that followed, Blake Toys underwent a transformation that no marketing campaign or business consultant could have orchestrated. What began as an accidental encounter with a 6-year-old girl behind a warehouse had evolved into a quiet yet powerful shift in the very soul of the company. Alexander Blake, once known for his strict adherence to corporate protocols and data-driven strategies, now found himself leading his business in a way that felt almost foreign yet deeply right. He was no longer obsessed with the sterile perfection of boardroom presentations. Instead, he was driven by a need to create something real, something meaningful, and Emmy had become his compass. Every morning, Emmy would arrive at the headquarters, her backpack as full as ever with scraps of materials and her boundless imagination. She had no formal schedule or job title, yet somehow, she had woven herself into the daily operations of the company more effectively than any executive he had ever hired. Employees greeted her with a sense of genuine warmth, not out of obligation, but because they had come to understand the weight of her presence. Emmy had become the mirror reflecting the company's forgotten purpose. One particular day, Alexander invited Emmy into a product development session with the senior design team. It was an important meeting, where new prototypes for the holiday season were to be finalized. The team had been working tirelessly, perfecting every curve, color, and packaging element. The designs were sleek, innovative in appearance, and certainly in line with current market trends. But when Emmy entered the room and was presented with the latest prototypes, her reaction was both immediate and disarmingly simple. She frowned, tilting her head, and asked, "But what does it do?" The designers looked at one another, somewhat baffled. They had spent months refining the aesthetics, but none of them had considered that a toy's value didn't lie in how it looked, but in how it made a child feel while playing. Emmy picked up one of the prototypes, a glossy plastic figurine, and turned it over in her hands. "It's pretty," she admitted, "but it doesn't let you imagine anything. It already tells you what it is." Her words, innocent but piercing, struck a chord that no focus group ever had. Alexander watched as his team absorbed the critique, not with defensiveness, but with an awakening curiosity. That single observation led to an impromptu brainstorming session, where Emmy's insights guided a complete overhaul of the project. Instead of rigid figurines, the team began sketching modular pieces that could be mixed, matched, and reimagined by children themselves. The energy in the room was electric. Designers who had grown accustomed to strict guidelines found themselves liberated, sketching wildly, bouncing ideas off Emmy, who seemed to navigate the creative chaos with ease. Alexander sat back, marveling at how a child who had no formal education in product development had managed to unlock a creative vein within his company that had been dormant for far too long. It was in that moment he realized how much of their work had been guided by fear of deviating from trends, of disappointing investors, of risking failure. But Emmy didn't know those fears. She created for the sake of creation, and that freedom was contagious. Later that day, as Alexander walked through the production floor with Emmy by his side, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Workers who had once been disengaged and mechanical in their routines were now more engaged, more attentive. Emmy would stop by their stations, ask questions about machines and materials, and they, in turn, found themselves explaining their work with newfound pride. It was as if the presence of a child, who saw wonder in the mundane, had reminded them that what they were doing mattered beyond profit margins and assembly quotas. Alexander found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him here. For years, his leadership had been defined by control over products, people, and outcomes. He had measured success in stock prices and market share, believing that as long as the numbers grew, so did the company's value. But now, as he watched Emmy teach a group of engineers how to craft a puppet from leftover packaging material, he understood how narrow that view had been. The true value of Blake Toys wasn't in its quarterly profits, but in its ability to inspire, to create, to imagine. That evening, after the office had emptied and the city lights flickered through the windows of his office, Alexander sat across from Emmy, who was busy constructing yet another fantastical character from paperclips and tape. He asked her, almost rhetorically, "Do you know you've changed this place?" Emmy didn't look up, simply shrugged, and said, "I just make stuff." Her answer, simple and pure, encapsulated everything he had been trying to articulate in board meetings and strategy sessions. He realized then that the future of his company wouldn't be dictated by trend forecasts or competitor analysis. It would be shaped by people who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty, to play, to build without fear of imperfection. Emmy had given his company permission to be human again. That night, as he drove Emmy home, though home was still an uncertain term for her, Alexander made a decision. He would no longer let his company operate in a way that forgot the people they were supposed to serve. It wasn't enough to produce toys that sold well. They had to produce toys that mattered, that allowed children to see themselves as creators, not just consumers. And Emmy would not be a temporary muse for the company's reinvention. She was the beginning of a permanent shift. As they drove past the factory where their paths had first crossed, Alexander glanced at Emmy, who had fallen asleep clutching one of her makeshift toys. He felt a wave of gratitude, not just for the impact she had on the company, but for the way she had quietly dismantled the walls he had built around his own life. She had reminded him that leadership wasn't about control, it was about connection. It was about listening, about seeing value where others saw waste, about understanding that true innovation often comes from the places you least expect. The road ahead would be filled with challenges. Investors would need convincing. The board would resist change. But Alexander no longer feared their doubts. He had found something more powerful than approval, purpose. And with Emmy by his side, he was ready to build a company that was no longer driven by what the market expected, but by what children truly deserved. The transformation of Blake Toys was no longer a quiet ripple within the company walls, it was now beginning to surface in the public eye. Journalists, once indifferent to the inner workings of a toy corporation, were now requesting interviews, curious about the story of a CEO who had brought a homeless child into his design team. Rumors spread quickly, some saw it as a marketing stunt, others as a risky, emotional decision from a businessman known for his strategic coldness. But those who had witnessed the change firsthand knew it was none of those things. It was real, it was personal, and it was reshaping everything. Alexander found himself in an unfamiliar position. He had been in the public spotlight many times, but always in control, presenting carefully crafted narratives built by PR teams. Now, the story was unfolding beyond his control. Emmy's influence was undeniable, and though she remained blissfully unaware of the corporate implications of her presence, she had become the face of a new era for the company. Every decision she touched seemed to breathe life back into Blake Toys, not because it was part of a calculated plan, but because it stemmed from genuine creativity and human connection. One afternoon, as Alexander prepared for an interview with a major news outlet, he noticed Emmy sitting by the large glass windows in his office, intently working on yet another small toy made from a broken pen and a few buttons she had found in a forgotten drawer. He watched her, marveling at how she could lose herself so completely in creation, oblivious to the power shifts occurring around her. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, yet she was reshaping the future of an entire corporation. During the interview, the journalist, a sharp woman named Grace Monroe, asked Alexander why he had chosen to involve a child with no formal education or industry knowledge in his company's product development. Alexander smiled, realizing how easy it would be to give a rehearsed answer. Instead, he said, because she reminded me what toys are supposed to be. For years, we designed products for shelves, for charts, for shareholders. Emmy designs for children. Grace leaned forward, clearly intrigued, and asked, but how do you scale that? How does a company this size sustain such an approach? Alexander didn't hesitate. By remembering that scale should never come at the expense of authenticity. If we lose that, we lose everything. The interview sparked a wave of public interest. Families who had grown tired of soulless, over-engineered toys resonated with the story. Social media exploded with images of children crafting their own toys from household items, inspired by Emmy's story. Blake Toys began receiving letters, not from corporations or investors, but from parents and children, thanking them for bringing creativity back into play. Internally, however, the pressure mounted. The board of directors, while impressed by the sudden surge in public goodwill, were still anxious. They demanded tangible results, financial metrics that justified this emotional shift. Alexander knew this confrontation was inevitable. He had prepared for it, but he also understood that no spreadsheet could capture what was happening within the walls of his company. At the next board meeting, Alexander arrived with Emmy. The room, filled with meticulously dressed executives and guarded expressions, fell into a hushed murmur. Emmy, unfazed, walked to the head of the table and unpacked her toys onto the polished mahogany surface. Alexander began the meeting not with profit projections, but with stories of how Emmy's influence had reignited creativity within his teams, how product lines had been redesigned to encourage imaginative play, how customers had responded with unprecedented enthusiasm. He addressed the board's concerns head-on. You want numbers? Sales for our new modular kits have doubled in the last month. Return rates have dropped because children aren't getting bored. Engagement on our digital platforms has increased, not because we paid for ads, but because people believe in what we're doing. But then, he shifted the focus. But beyond numbers, we've built something far more valuable: trust. Trust with our employees, with families, with a generation that's tired of being marketed to and wants to be included. The board members exchanged glances, some skeptical, others contemplative. Alexander knew this wasn't a fight he could win with data alone. But as Emmy, unaware of the corporate tension, stood beside him, proudly holding up a toy she had crafted from old office supplies, the atmosphere shifted. Her presence was a living argument no presentation could surpass. She wasn't a statistic. She was a symbol of everything the company had forgotten and everything it could become again. After the meeting, as the board recessed into private discussions, Alexander and Emmy returned to his office. He felt the weight of the uncertainty but also a profound clarity. Regardless of the board's final decision, he had no intention of returning to the old ways. The company's future was already being written, not in quarterly reports, but in the stories of children like Emmy, who found joy in creation, not consumption. That evening, as the city's skyline glowed against the darkening sky, Alexander sat by Emmy while she crafted yet another fantastical character, this time using spare computer parts and colored paper. Watching her, he realized that leadership wasn't about always having the answers. Sometimes, it was about having the courage to admit you had been asking the wrong questions all along. In that quiet moment, surrounded by Emmy's creations scattered across his office floor, Alexander understood the true scope of what they were building. This was no longer just about toys. It was about giving voice to those who had none, about finding value in places the world had written off, and about leading a company not through control, but through connection. The challenges would continue. Investors would need more than heartfelt stories, and markets would demand metrics. But Alexander knew now that the real foundation of Blake Toys wasn't built on figures. It was built on imagination, on trust, and on the unwavering belief that sometimes, the smallest hands craft the most powerful ideas. The days that followed the board meeting were a delicate balancing act for Alexander Blake. The investors had not given him an outright rejection, but their approval was cautious and conditional. They wanted numbers, timelines, and guarantees that the emotional momentum he had sparked could be translated into tangible business success. Yet, despite their skepticism, there was a noticeable shift. The sincerity of Emmy's presence had struck a chord deeper than any strategic report could have. The company had found itself at a crossroads, where decisions were no longer purely transactional but personal, layered with the complexity of human impact. Meanwhile, within the walls of Blake Toys, the culture had evolved beyond anything Alexander had anticipated. Departments that had once operated in competitive silos were now cross-pollinating ideas in ways that transcended corporate hierarchy. Meetings became open forums where even the most junior employees felt empowered to contribute, emboldened by the knowledge that a 6-year-old girl had reshaped the company's direction simply by being heard. Emmy's influence was everywhere, not in a performative, superficial way, but in the quiet, profound shift in how people approached their work. Her curiosity had infected the staff, making them rethink not only how they designed toys but why they designed them. One afternoon, as Alexander walked through the company's prototype lab, he noticed a group of engineers huddled around Emmy. She was sitting on a tall stool, swinging her legs as she listened intently to their explanations of a new modular playset that allowed children to create their own characters from interchangeable pieces. The engineers were animated, pointing to sketches and parts, but Emmy, with her simple, piercing logic, interrupted them. "It's fun, but it needs a story. Kids want to know why they're building it. What's the adventure?" The room went silent as her words settled in. It was a moment of clarity. For years, they had designed toys to be impressive on shelves, to appeal to parents' wallets. They had forgotten that children don't buy toys for features, they buy them for the stories they imagine with them. Alexander stood back, watching this exchange with a mixture of pride and humility. Emmy didn't understand the language of profit margins or consumer trends, yet she was teaching his team lessons no MBA program could provide. Her understanding of play was pure, uncorrupted by market strategies, and it was precisely what the company needed to reclaim its soul. Despite the internal success, the external pressure remained relentless. Media outlets continued to follow the story, some praising Alexander's innovative leadership, others criticizing it as reckless and emotionally driven. Shareholders sent him emails filled with veiled ultimatums, demanding concrete results. The pressure was mounting, but Alexander had already decided that he would not revert to old strategies to appease short-term fears. He had seen what authenticity could build, and he was determined to protect it. To bridge the gap between the board's need for metrics and his commitment to meaningful innovation, Alexander proposed an ambitious public project. It wasn't a product launch or a traditional campaign. It was a community-driven initiative where Blake Toys would set up creative workshops in underprivileged neighborhoods, providing materials for children to build their own toys, guided by company designers who would listen and learn, rather than dictate. It was a risk, financially unorthodox and logistically complex, but it aligned perfectly with the philosophy Emmy had reintroduced to the company. He named it the Imagination Project. The board was hesitant, questioning the immediate return on investment, but Alexander presented them with a clear, unwavering vision. This was not about immediate profits. It was about building a brand that was trusted, loved, and remembered. In a market saturated with mass-produced, over-marketed products, authenticity had become the rarest and most valuable commodity. The Imagination Project would not just be a marketing campaign, it would be the company's identity. As preparations began, Alexander and Emmy worked closely with the design teams to ensure the project remained true to its purpose. Emmy's role was never formalized with a title or contract, yet everyone understood that her insights were now integral to their creative process. She was no longer just a symbol of change, she was an active architect of the company's future. The day the first workshop was set up, Alexander felt a rare mix of nerves and excitement. It was held in a community center far from the polished corporate world he was used to. Rows of tables were covered with craft supplies, recycled materials, and simple tools. Company employees, dressed not in suits but in casual clothes, waited with anticipation as children began to arrive. Emmy was at the center of it all, her backpack slung over her shoulder, ready to lead by example. What unfolded was more than a workshop. It was a revelation. Children dove into the materials with a fervor that no focus group could have predicted. They didn't need instructions, they needed space to create, to imagine freely. The designers, who had once labored over market-driven aesthetics, now sat beside these children, learning from their spontaneous brilliance. Alexander watched as his employees, some of whom had never stepped out of the corporate environment, discovered the raw joy of creation without limitations. Emmy, true to form, floated through the room, offering suggestions, asking questions, and sparking ideas. She wasn't a guest of honor, she was a collaborator, a mentor, and most importantly, a peer to the children who, like her, saw the world not in terms of what is, but in what could be. By the end of the day, Alexander knew that the Imagination Project was not just a corporate initiative. It was a movement. One that would redefine not only Blake Toys but perhaps the entire industry's understanding of play, creativity, and connection. That evening, as the sun set and the last of the makeshift toys were packed away, Alexander sat with Emmy on the steps of the community center. She was tired but glowing with the satisfaction of a day well spent. Alexander looked at her, this small girl who had wandered into his life with a request for super glue and unknowingly mended the very foundation of his company. "You know, Emmy," he said quietly, "you've built something today that no factory could ever make." She smiled, leaning her head against his arm, and replied, "I just like making stuff with people." In that simple statement, Alexander found the essence of everything he had been searching for in spreadsheets and strategy meetings. It wasn't about making products. It was about making connections. And with Emmy by his side, he knew they were just at the beginning of something far greater than either of them could have imagined. The weeks that followed the launch of the Imagination Project marked a turning point not only for Blake Toys but for Alexander Blake himself. The initiative had started as a bold experiment, born out of frustration with corporate detachment and inspired by the unfiltered creativity of a little girl who had no agenda beyond wanting to play. Yet, what unfolded was far beyond what Alexander had anticipated. The workshop spread from city to city, transforming neglected community centers into vibrant spaces of laughter, storytelling, and invention. Children, many of whom had never owned a store-bought toy, found joy in crafting their own creations from materials others had deemed useless. Their ideas were unpolished, raw, and wildly imaginative, precisely what the world of mass-produced toys had forgotten. Within Blake Toys, the ripple effects became waves. Employees who once spent their days perfecting CAD models and debating color palettes in sterile meeting rooms were now spending time on the ground, interacting directly with the children they were designing for. The experience shattered the abstract notion of a target demographic. These were no longer faceless statistics, they were real children with names, stories, and dreams. Designers who had grown cynical over years of corporate cycles found themselves reawakened, their passion reignited not by profits but by purpose. Alexander watched this transformation with a sense of awe and humility. For years, he had believed leadership was about control, about tightening the reins to maintain order and predictability. But now, as he stood amidst teams sketching ideas based on playground conversations rather than boardroom forecasts, he understood that real leadership was about creating space for others to bring their best selves forward. He no longer had to dictate every outcome. His role had shifted to being a listener, a facilitator of creativity, allowing his company to be shaped by the very people it sought to serve. Despite the internal success, external scrutiny remained. Investors, though pleased with the surge in public goodwill, still pressed for hard metrics. Media outlets continued to spin narratives, some praising Blake Toys as a pioneer of socially conscious business, while others dismissed it as a temporary phase. But Alexander had grown indifferent to these external pressures. He had discovered a truth that no market analyst could quantify: authenticity, once embraced, had a way of sustaining itself. The company's financial health stabilized, not through aggressive marketing strategies, but through genuine consumer loyalty. Parents trusted Blake Toys not because of slick advertising but because the company had demonstrated a willingness to listen to their children. The day Emmy's legal adoption papers were finalized was not marked by grand announcements or media fanfare. It was a quiet afternoon, filled with paperwork and a few close friends who had witnessed the journey firsthand. For Alexander, it was the culmination of a transformation that had begun the moment Emmy had approached him with a broken toy and an innocent request for superglue. She was no longer a visitor to his world. She was family, not just in name but in every shared moment of creativity, every laugh, every challenge they had navigated together. That evening, as they sat in their modest home surrounded by Emmy's ever-growing collection of makeshift toys, Alexander felt a profound sense of peace. The city lights glimmered in the distance, a reminder of the corporate empire that still bore his name, but his focus was entirely on the present, on Emmy carefully constructing a cardboard castle, narrating an elaborate story as she worked. It struck him how this simple act, a child playing on the living room floor, held more significance than any quarterly profit report ever could. Blake Toys had become a reflection of this new philosophy. The company was no longer defined by rigid structures or dictated trends. It had become a living, evolving ecosystem where creativity was nurtured at every level. The Imagination Project had expanded into schools and community programs, and its influence began to be felt in industry conversations about sustainable design and child-centered innovation. Alexander had not only built a business model, he had sparked a movement. The final confirmation of this shift came unexpectedly. One morning, a major competitor reached out, proposing a collaborative initiative focused on community-driven toy design. It was a gesture of respect, a recognition that the old ways of doing business were no longer sufficient. Alexander accepted, not out of strategic advantage, but because he believed in the ripple effect of shared creativity. The industry, once characterized by competition and secrecy, was beginning to evolve into a space of collaboration and mutual growth. As the days turned into months, Alexander found himself less in boardrooms and more in classrooms, community centers, and workshops, often accompanied by Emmy, who had become an unofficial ambassador of the company's values. Their bond was no longer just a personal connection but a symbol of what was possible when leadership embraced humility and openness. One evening, as they walked home after a long day of creative sessions, Emmy tugged at his hand and asked, "Do you think everyone will start making their own toys now?" Alexander smiled, looking down at her. "I think we've reminded people that they always could," he replied. In that moment, he realized the journey they had embarked on was not about saving a company or even transforming an industry. It was about rediscovering the simple, powerful truth that creation belongs to everyone, and that leadership isn't about building empires, it's about building spaces where others can thrive. Emmy had taught him that. Not through lectures or strategies, but through the quiet, persistent act of play. As they reached their front door, Alexander paused, taking in the life they had built together. It wasn't grand or flawless, but it was real, vibrant, and filled with purpose. He knew the challenges would continue, that the world of business would always try to pull him back into its cold metrics and competitive posturing. But now, he had a compass that would never let him lose his way again. In the end, Alexander Blake's greatest legacy wasn't Blake Toys. It was the understanding that the smallest voices often carry the most profound wisdom, if only we have the courage to listen. In my view, the The true power of this story lies not in its corporate triumphs or emotional twists, but in how it strips leadership down to its rawest form, empathy and humility. Alexander's transformation is not just a redemption arc for a cold businessman, it's a mirror for anyone who has ever let status, numbers, or routines distance them from real human connection. Emmy's character represents a kind of truth that business, and society at large, often overlooks. Brilliance isn't born from privilege or polished titles, but from unfiltered imagination and lived experience. The ending, where Alexander realizes that his legacy isn't the empire he built but the space he created for others to thrive, is deeply satisfying because it feels earned. It doesn't rely on dramatic gestures, but on quiet, consistent choices that reshape values from the inside out. This is a story about seeing worth where others see waste, and about redefining success not by profit, but by the lives you touch. What makes it especially powerful is that it doesn't present change as a grand, idealistic revolution. It shows it as a daily, messy, human process that starts small, with listening, with paying attention to people no one expects to have answers. That's what makes it not just heartwarming, but profoundly inspiring.